All right, party people, chapter 1, social problems. Let's do this. Studying social problems. Okay, so this chapter gives us a lot of information that we're going to continue to discuss in this class. So keep that in mind that we're going to explore these things more in depth in future weeks. So, we're going to go over the benefits of learning about sociology and using the sociological imagination. We're going to explore the concept of a social problem and how some things get to be viewed as social problems while others don't. And we'll talk a little bit about theory and methods, two subjects that are so dense, they're their own classes that I teach. So anyway, we'll just touch on those things, but I want to kind of put that out there in case there's things you don't understand right away. No prob, we're going to keep talking about it. Okay, so looking at seeing patterns. So the sociological imagination is a point of view that highlights how society affects the experiences we have and the choices we make. So one example could be job loss or unemployment. If we look narrowly at the individual, we miss the larger picture. So in 2008, when the economy crashed, millions of people were affected, with some losing hours, getting pay cuts and furloughs, while others were laid off from their jobs. So even during a normal economy, millions of people lose their jobs. So this shows how job loss is not merely the result of personal choices, it can be affected by larger structural changes, like the economy crashing in 2008 because a bunch of banksters, defrauded the government. Another example could be homelessness. So we do have an agency, in our lives, meaning we have the power to make choices in our lives. That's what agency means. But the choices that we can make are constrained by the social reality of the time period that we live in. So oftentimes, you are making a choice, but you're making a choice that's limited by the time period. So for example, let's say choosing a career. That's a personal choice. But if it was 100 years ago, I would not be doing this job because women were legally restricted from doing this job. We're not given access to higher education to get the degrees necessary to do this job, right? They could work as a preschool teacher. So it's important to not just look at the individual and their choices, but also the larger kind of structures of society. And that's really what the sociological imagination is all about, connecting the individual's experience with the larger structural forces. Because if you just look at the individual, you miss the structure. If you just look at the structure, sometimes things become numbers and you miss the individual. So going back to that homelessness example, sometimes we talk about, this many thousands of people, this many millions of people experience homelessness. But we don't often kind of look at homeless people and humanize them, especially when it comes to the media, right? So oftentimes when we hear the numbers, the large scale of the problem, we miss the humanity of the issue. So anyway, rant. We'll get back to that eventually. We're going to keep talking about sociological imagination throughout. Okay, getting through some of the terminology from the chapter. Sociology is the systematic study of human societies. And society itself is defined as people who live within some territory and share many patterns of behavior. So society is similar to culture, but they do have slightly different meanings, though people tend to use them interchangeably. So we're all part of American society, but American society is made up of many cultures. So culture is a way of life. So this can be values that are widely held or accepted, such as ideas about what's good or what's bad, or beliefs which are shared, these kind of ideas about what's true. And of course, culture is going to then impact our behaviors, because if it impacts our thoughts, it will then translate to our actions, right? So what we end up doing in our everyday lives is impacted by the cultural expectations that exist for us. So like I said before, there's a diversity of cultural patterns in the US, and most of us inhabit various cultures within the culture or subcultures. So we'll talk more about those groups and their patterns in later lectures. So sociology's key insight is that many personal troubles that people experience in their everyday lives are really social issues. And these issues have their roots in the operation of larger society itself. So when we apply our sociological imagination, we can see how society shapes our personal lives. And when we see how things operate and create patterns, we can use that information. And that gives sociology the power to bring about change, which is very important. And again, the discipline itself is very closely linked to activism for a reason, as we'll talk about later. Okay, looking specifically at social problems. What are social problems? A social problem is defined as a condition that undermines the well-being of some or all members of a society. A social problem is usually something that's controversial in some aspect. Social problems are conditions that cause harm immediately or over time. Social problems often spark controversy. An important part of that is that people view them differently depending on their social location. So we're going to talk about social locations more in depth later as well, but these are the intersecting statuses that will give you a particular viewpoint of the world. So for instance, the social hierarchies that you're a part of, right? So as a woman, that's going to be one of my identities, but gender's not my only identity, right? Race, ethnicity is another identity. There's so many intersecting identities. Sexual orientation, ability or disability, all sorts of different things, whether it's age, location, the country you live in, all sorts of factors. Your nationality status, like are you documented or undocumented? All of these things intersect to give you different results, meaning we often speak of groups in monoliths, like women this, men that, or we'll even put people in pan-ethnic categories, like, Asian people, white people, right? These kind of weird big pan-ethnic categories, they're really just like a million cultures squeezed into one. So by doing that, we often ignore the intersections that actually create a much more specific situation for all of us, depending on how those things intersect and what our location. So social location means what's your place in the hierarchy. Imagine each one of your identities is a ladder, right? So if you are incredibly wealthy, white, cisgendered male, right, then you're the top of some ladders, right? But maybe you're a cisgendered male, white, in American society, but maybe you're very poor, right? Or maybe you have low educational attainment, or any of these kind of other factors that would affect your social location, and really how you interact with the world, how people treat you, right? So we'll talk much more about that later as well. So part of something being a social problem is that it's not always harmful to everybody. So it's often felt the most by those who are the most marginal, or those who have the least power, because the people that have the most power are able to avoid some social problems. So we'll talk about that later, like, for instance, environmental devastation, climate change, the world is experiencing some real problems right now as a result of human activity. And what are the billionaires doing? Are they fixing it? Are they using their ridiculous piles of money to make life better for all of us? No, they're trying to figure out a way to get off this planet. So that's what I'm talking about the people who are the most marginal and have the least power usually are the ones who can't avoid social problems. So we'll talk about that later too. So when we look at social problems over time, the chapter specifically looked at people's beliefs over time about what are the most important social problems. And so what this demonstrates is that, history affects our perceptions. So what we think are social problems sometimes are throughout, and other times really differ depending on the conditions of that time period. So table 1-1 in your textbook kind of shows this. So you can see that some of the perceived social problems were very different in the two time periods, but there were also 3 issues that remained across both, which was the economy, unemployment, and dissatisfaction with the government, which I guarantee past 2017, those would still be 3 of them there as well. So this shows how our time period then affects our perceptions of social problems. Okay, so we're going to go back to some of the sociological theories and how they look at social problems. So now again, this is the tip of the iceberg. We will talk about these theories much more in depth later. If you don't get it today, totally fine, no worries. Okay, so the social constructionist approach is the assertion that social problems arise as people define conditions as undesirable and in need of change. So to back up a little, to say something is socially constructed means that we define what it is as a group, and that definition forms its meaning. So we create a social reality, and we reinforce it each day individually when we interact, and of course on a macro scale. So any issue that's not considered a problem now may be viewed as a problem in the future. So think back to all of the horrible things that at one point in history people had normalized, right? Like how, child labor, for instance. Something that was an issue about 100 years ago in this country was not considered a social problem when children were making profit by working in factories using their tiny little fingers to unjam all those industrial looms. Remember though, it was not all children who worked, right? Only the poor ones, most often immigrants. So the social status of being poor and immigrant affected people's perceptions of the social problem. Fast forward to today, there's still a huge problem with child labor. But now it happens far away in factories for all the products we wear, all the consumer crap that we buy and then throw away. So it's out of sight, out of mind. It's not our concern because we have the privilege to ignore it. So this somewhat illustrates what the theoretical approach of social constructionism is trying to say, that who we are and where we are and when we are affects how we perceive social issues. Gender inequality is an example, of the social constructionist approach. They would point out that at one point in history, it was normal for women to be legally restricted from doing certain jobs and for them to be seen as caretakers of children and the home. And while some of those ideas linger, and we'll talk about why they do later when we talk about gender, today, women are much more socially equal than they were 100 years ago. And we also have more overall social awareness of gender inequality in society. Our cultural standards have changed, right? Thanks to social movements. So we expect women and men to be socially equal in most regards. Okay, so claims making is something we're going to talk about throughout the class as well. Claims making are efforts by officials, individuals, and organizations to convince others that a particular issue or situation should be seen as a social problem. So it starts with challenging the status quo, or the hegemonic values, the taken for granted dominant values of society. That's what hegemony means. So in the claims making process, people explain exactly what changes are needed and why they're needed. And public officials and powerful individuals can make claims because they do have bigger platforms and more people listen to them. But, we all have our voices. We all have the right to be heard. And so ordinary people can make claims too and speak out against issues that we see that should be addressed. So the book uses the Me Too and Time's Up movements as examples of public mobilization that was driven by regular people who wanted to call attention to the problems of sexual harassment and sexual assault and its prevalence in American society. Okay, so looking at social problems and media coverage, the more a topic is spoken about in the media as an issue, the more likely it will be considered a social problem. So this is also how people refute that it's a social problem, right? There's often a deliberate use of language. This is an important part of claims making. Super true when it comes to problems in social movements, right? So how do we address these social movements? Often, right, how do we fix the problems? Well, it's through social movements. Social movements are organized efforts to address social issues and create change. In this class, we're going to talk about various movements throughout time and in the modern era that attempt to address social problems. But there are stages to social movements. The first stage is emergence, where the initial claims are made. This leads to a second stage of coalescence, where claims become publicized. So this can be when people hear about the issue in the media. This often leads to the third stage, which is formalization, in which claims are recognized as part of a political debate. And then the last and final stage is decline, in which public interest in claims goes down. And when we talk about social movements, we'll talk much more about why that is. Okay, moving to the 8 assertions they speak about in the chapter. Want to make sure I go through these clearly because this is, really connected to understanding the basics of why are we talking about social problems. So the first of the 8 assertions is that social problems result from the ways in which society operates. So because we live in a society that always talks about being an individual and values individualism so strongly, the result is we tend to think people are responsible for their own lives in all aspects. But what we will discuss in this course is how the operation of society itself creates social problems that affect many people's lives. And it's not just the result of their personal actions. The book uses the example of income inequality in the US, which of course we're going to later discuss how the economic system itself works, in a way that benefits those with the most power, right? So specifically, though, if we look at corporate salary policies and government tax policies, they help the rich get richer and the rest of us get poorer. So people are working longer hours than ever before, more jobs than ever, and are largely getting nowhere, right? And that's clearly not the result of their effort. It's a failing of our economic system to have, such rampant income inequality in our country. Okay, so the second one, social problems are not caused by bad people. So there are bad people out there, for sure, that do bad things. But in general, pointing at bad people as a source of social problems is narrow in thinking, right? So we often do this with mass shooters, right? We'll look at their background, we blame things like the music they listen to, movies they watched, but not the pressure that we put on men in society to prove they're men. The fact that gun violence is often about a loss of power, such as being unemployed, experiencing divorce, going through hardships, and if we count other gun deaths, such as suicides, many men are self-harming because they face pressure, and we live in a culture that tells men to hold in their feelings and pretend like everything is okay, right? We'll talk about those issues later on as well. Okay, so the third assertion is that problems are socially constructed as people define a condition as harmful and in need of change. If people don't believe something's a problem, then it's going to continue. It's only when people come together and acknowledge it as a problem that it becomes socially defined as a problem. The fourth is that people see problems differently. So who you are and your experiences that you've had frame your understanding of the world. So this could be a person's age, their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their social class, many other factors that shape how we see the world. The fifth assertion is that definitions of problems change over time. Our history and our time period, they shape our values and our beliefs. So what's considered a problem is connected to the social understandings of the time period. The sixth is that problems involve subjective values as well as objective fact. So the book uses the example of divorce to illustrate this. About a third of people have been divorced. So is divorce a social problem? Some would say yes, it's a problem because it changes the family structure. Others would point out that before divorce was available, many women were trapped in abusive situations with no escape. Others would argue that it's better for a couple to split than force a relationship that doesn't work. So our subjective values, or how we interpret divorce, complicates our analysis of objective facts, such as that a third of people are divorced. And then the seventh one, many but not all social problems can be solved. This is why we want to study them, right? This is the key in sociology. We got to figure out solutions. We want to make the world better. But some people argue that not all social problems can be solved. And another complication is the eighth, that various social problems are related, right? This is because they're rooted in how society works. So sometimes addressing one social problem can actually help alleviate other social problems at the same time. Okay, taking a global perspective, when we adopt a global perspective, we can see that some social problems cross national boundaries. And examining these larger global issues, they show us patterns of inequality that often stem from colonialism and the unequal world it created and maintains. We can also see different cultures around the world face different problems. So another resource from your book, the Global Map 1-1, looks at women's childbearing in global perspective. It shows that in rich countries like the US, a typical woman will have 1 to 2 children. But in poorer countries, it could be more normal for a woman to have 5 or an average of 7 children. And this, of course, has a lot to do with the state of women's rights within those nations. Because when you give women the right to choose whether they want to have kids or not, the average numbers of births drop as people opt for contraceptives instead. Okay, so analyzing social problems, how do we do it? Well, first, theories, right? Theory is just a statement of how and why a specific fact is related. A theoretical approach is a basic image of society that guides theory and research. So there's various theoretical approaches, but in sociology we tend to focus on a few major paradigms, especially at the 102 level, right there. I want you to know these 3 main ones, but remember there's like a million other theoretical paradigms as well. Just want to throw that out there. Sometimes people leave these classes thinking there's only 3, and you're like, no, there's a whole group of them, right? But these are the ones that like you gotta know, right? You gotta know the larger, umbrella theoretical approaches: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. And you will, because we're just going to keep talking about them. So there's many more that we'll touch upon a little bit, but we got to talk about the big ones. So the structural functional approach, otherwise known as functionalism, is a theoretical framework that sees society as a system of many interrelated parts. I think the best example of it is, that it's like puzzle pieces, right? And so each institution in society is a piece of the puzzle. And so when one institution changes, then in shape, then the whole puzzle changes, right? Because they all connect and, are related to each other. So just to define, social institutions are something we're going to talk a lot about in this class. They are these major spheres of social life, or social subsystems that are organized to meet basic human needs. So an example of a social institution is education. You're doing it right now. So when we look at early functional theory, they saw problems as social pathology. So basically social problems like a disease. A famous and widely misinterpreted version of this is social Darwinism, which is, has very little support today as most people realize the issues with the logic, but, we'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. Also, functionalism is known for the Chicago School, which was popular in the 1920s and 1930s, that started looking at social problems as problems of disorganization. So they saw changes that were happening in that time period of rapid industrialization and urbanization, and they started looking at the organization of cities, which eventually evolved into social disorganization theory that says that social problems happen when society breaks down because social change is happening so quickly. And more recent functionalism looks at social problems as dysfunctions. So a big part of functionalism is how things work or function. So looking for social patterns to devise meaning from. So we'll talk much more about this theory later and apply it to different social problems. Okay, moving on to social conflict approach, otherwise known as conflict theory. It's a theoretical framework that sees society as divided by inequality and conflict. So Marx's theory looks at how social problems are the result of class conflict and inequality. Marx talked about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. He believed, and again, the proletariat being the workers, the bourgeoisie being the wealthy people. That's why you'll hear people say, oh, they're so bougie. Yeah, I mean bourgeoisie. So he believed that the workers would come together and achieve class consciousness instead of false consciousness. So class consciousness is basically realizing you're all getting screwed by the same handful of rich people, right? But false consciousness is, and this is happening a lot in our culture today, false consciousness is when you identify with those oppressing you and basically think, like for example, people will say, well, I don't want to put laws or rules on billionaires. We shouldn't tax billionaires because someday I'm going to be a billionaire and I won't want to be taxed, right? That's false consciousness. You're not going to be a billionaire. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you it's not going to happen for you, right? So false consciousness is thinking in line or in the way that those people in power want you to think, right? Versus class consciousness is realizing you're getting screwed and coming together to do something about it. Okay, another under the umbrella of conflict theory is multiculturalism. So, looking at problems of racial and ethnic inequality. So while some racist institutions have faded, there's still a strict racial hierarchy in our society. Michelle Alexander talks about this. I talk about it in my crim class if you want to take that class too. Calling them racial caste systems. So she argues that racism did not die with slavery. It changed. So we got a new racial caste system in Jim Crow segregation. And she argues when that caste system was toppled by the civil rights movement, we got our modern racial caste system, mass incarceration. So we're going to explore her argument later more in depth, but that's just one example. And then you have the feminist approach, which also is under the banner of conflict theory, which looks at social problems through the lens of feminism, which is a political movement that seeks social equality of all genders. So gender conflict theory explains social problems in terms of men's dominance over women, or in cisgender people's dominance over those who are trans or gender nonconforming. And so we're going to explore this much more when we discuss gender, and I'll give you some more examples at that point. Okay, moving to symbolic interaction approach. This is a theoretical framework that sees society as the product of individuals interacting with one another. So the definition of things has to do with our meanings. So if you just think of a tree, right? What does it mean to be a tree? What does the tree mean? Well, symbolic interactionists would say the tree's meaning has to do with how we use it or how we interact with it, right? So for instance, it's a really hot day. You stand under that tree, you sit under that tree, then that tree means shade, right? Or let's say, you want to see something far away, climbing up in that tree, the tree means a lookout point. Or maybe you're building material or you're, building a fire, then the tree means lumber, right? Or wood to be used for other purposes. So the way that symbolic interactionists understand things means that the definition of those things has to do with our meanings for them. So the tree could, the meaning can be different to different people based on how they're interacting with it. So under this umbrella is also learning theory, which, looks at problems and the social environment. So learning theory claims that people learn troublesome attitudes and behaviors from other people around them, and that they gradually engage in certain behaviors as they learn those skills and attitudes from other people. So another theory under that same umbrella of symbolic interactionism is labeling theory, right? That looks at problems and social definitions, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about deviance. So labeling argues that the reality of a situation is what people define it as. So labeling theory explores how if we're labeled as something, it affects your social definition, right? So let's say your mom was always like, you're the most handsome boy in the world, then you're going to think, hey, I'm the most handsome boy in the world, right? Or if someone's like, you're really smart, and you hear that all the time, you're so smart, then you're going to think you're smart. But labeling theory also goes the other way. What if someone says you're a bad kid? What if they say you're stupid? What if they say you're worthless, right? Then you internalize those labels and you actually become the labels, meaning, especially when it comes to deviance, when you say someone's a bad kid, what ends up happening is it's like an ego defense thing we'll talk about with deviance. You end up leaning into the identity to be like, I'll show you how bad I can be, right? So we'll talk much more about these later. Okay, so how do we find these facts? How do we know this stuff, right? That's research methods. This is how we find out our social facts. We use different kinds of research methods to find out different kinds of information. So survey research asks questions. I'm sure all of you have had to take a survey at some point. It's a great method because it looks at people's opinions and their experiences. Plus, they're cheap to do and easy to distribute. So that's why they're so often done for research. There's also field research, where you join in, meaning field research is a method for observing people while joining them in their everyday activities. So this is a great way to understand groups, but there are some drawbacks, like how time-consuming it can be. There's also experimental research that looks for causes. So this is a research method that investigates a cause and effect relationship under tightly controlled conditions. So meaning it's done in a lab, right? So that researchers can change one variable while keeping another variable the same. So one example of this could be the famous Bobo doll experiment. I'm not sure if you're aware of this one, right? Where the basically they wanted to understand if children will act more violently if they witness an adult acting more violently. So they put this Bobo doll, one of those like big inflatable kind of clown dealies, but it had like a weighted base. And so in the lab, kids would watch an adult go in the room and just like beat the crap out of this doll, just hit it and smack it and throw it around. And then another set of kids would see a person interact with it, but not violently, just kind of bop it or just kind of play with other stuff. And then they measured, what did the kids do that saw the violence? Were they more violent than the control group who didn't? And the answer was yes. Yeah. Yep. Adults often model violence. Okay, and then there's another kind of research we'll talk about too, secondary analysis. This is using available data. So you use information that someone else collected, but it can be all kinds of things, from the census that you can use to understand shifting racial demographics of an area, or you could even analyze like a TV show for its social narratives. All sorts of fun stuff you can do with secondary analysis. For more information, you got to take my research methods class. Okay, looking at more finding the facts. So when it comes to truth, science, and politics, science can help us learn how many U.S. families are poor and why they're poor. But science can't tell us what we should do about it. So when we confront a social problem, we use science to gather facts and our political values for deciding how to respond. So two views happen within this. So some people think that sociologists should remain value-free in their research and try to discover truth, which we'll talk about more in depth, while others say that sociologists have a responsibility to learn about the world and try to make it better. So that's kind of the two opposing views. One is a bit older a view, and one's a bit newer a view. When we look at statistics, many of us have been taught to see statistics as fact. And they often are, right? When they come from careful analysis and, diligently done methodological studies. But numbers are not always truthful for two reasons. So like all research, numbers can be interpreted, right? And organizations, politicians, and even sociologists sometimes present statistics that support a preferred conclusion. So 3 tips to make you a more critical reader is to check how the researchers define their terms. And remember, research is never perfect, right? Things have to be peer-reviewed before they can really kind of reach the level of science, meaning you have other experts in the field that review the data or sometimes even replicate the study to make sure that it makes sense. And that researchers, especially those who are not academic, right? You have a lot of research that's done in a more capitalistic sense or for business or marketing. Sometimes they're going to spin their statistics. So you got to be more critical of this. That's why I want to go through these really quick, the figures from your book about do statistics lie? So, analysts can spin their data to encourage readers to reach various conclusions. So these couple graphs I'm going to show you are based on the same data, but the way they are constructed it suggests different outcomes or different results. So the scale that's used in this graph gives the impression that the employment rate displays a lot of volatility. Like, look at it, it's going up and down, right? And, over time. So you have the percent of the labor force, and then you have this kind of specific year set, what looks like from about 1980 to 2020, right? Now, if you look at this graph, B, you see that the scale has flattened the line, giving us the impression that employment's pretty stable, right? Because look at the scale difference. If you go back to here, you see the scale is like 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 by 2s. If you go to this scale, it's by 20s. It makes the variability of this particular graph look very smooth, right? And then with this one, this one only provides data from 2011 through 2018, giving the impression that the unemployment rate was sharply falling. So the reason I show you all 3 of these is to demonstrate this is the same data as this, and that it's up to us to be critical consumers of data and to, understand research methods. This is kind of my big pitch for why people should take research methods classes. Because even if you're like, I don't want to do research myself, you don't want to get fooled though, do you? You don't want to get sold. You don't want to get manipulated, right? And so that's the importance of understanding how research methods work, is to actually kind of sort the fact from the fiction. Okay, so how do we respond to social problems? Well, policy evaluation is one of them. So we create policies that are supposed to address things. But how do we know if the policy works? To figure that out, we have to ask other questions like, how do we measure success? Oh man, I'm going to tangent. I can feel it coming. Okay, so for instance, welfare changes in the 1990s created the birth of what's called TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. So the question becomes, is success less people being on government assistance? If so, then welfare changes in the 90s were successful. Less people are on government assistance than before. Or is success less people being in poverty? If success is less people being in poverty, then the welfare changes in the 90s failed terribly as many more people are in poverty now. So how do we measure success is important, and often our political ideology affects what kind of success we're looking for. Okay, so then looking at social policy, this is also shaped by cultural values. That is societies respond to a social problem in a particular way, not necessarily because that approach is cheapest or works best, but because a particular response according to society's culture seems to be the right thing to do. So social policy itself are the formal strategies that affect how society operates. And when we look at policy and politics, in general, conservative people try to limit the scope of societal change, while people with more liberal views see problems in the organization of society itself, so they favor greater social change. And we'll get into a bunch of examples of this throughout the class. The political spectrum is a continuum that represents a range of political attitudes from left to right. Attitudes on the political spectrum range from far left at one extreme to middle-of-the-road views at the center and far right at the other extreme. At any time, there's always a wide variation in the nation's political thinking. Okay, constructing problems and defining solutions. So conservatives believe that the past is a store of wisdom, developed by countless generations who have already confronted many of the same questions and issues that we face today. So conservatives have a special interest in the family and religion, the social institutions that transmit our moral traditions. So they seek to limit the size and scope of the government. While liberals think people should be free from the past to decide on their own about questions of how to live. And they have a special interest in the economy and politics because these are the social institutions that distribute wealth and power. So they typically seek to expand the size and scope of the government. Radicals point to some basic flaw in society that's responsible for any number of social problems. So a socially just society could exist only after the abolition of capitalism, they argue, or that a socially just society could only exist with the abolition of gender differences, racial and ethnic differences, of these social hierarchies that award more value to certain groups over others. So when looking at social issues, these are defined by your textbook as political debates involving moral judgments about how people should live. Some people lean left and others lean right. But what does that mean? Leaning left means believing that people should be free to shape their lifestyles for themselves. And, people that lean left are broadly tolerant of various alternative lifestyles, which includes expanding opportunities for women and opposing the death penalty. While leaning right means being respectful of traditional values and wanting to conserve them. And they tend to favor pro-life side of the abortion controversy. Typically, they also support the traditional family in which women and men have very different roles and responsibilities, such as being a stay-at-home mother. They also endorse the death penalty as a necessary moral response to especially brutal criminal acts. So we're going to talk much more about what these mean, and especially right now, when talking about economic issues. So there are political debates about how a society should produce and distribute material resources. So leaning left on this issue means favoring government regulation of the economy in order to reduce inequality and support strong government that's able to regulate the economy through policies such as raising the minimum wage, setting high taxes on the rich, things like that. Leaning right is arguing that the market, not government officials, can set wages more fairly and efficiently. They argue that motivated individuals and businesses they create are key to growing the economy, generating greater wealth and benefits so that they support lower tax rates on businesses. And when looking at who thinks what, so people that have high social positions tend to be liberal on social issues, but tend to be conservative on economic issues, which is ironic because how are you going to pay for those liberal social issues if you don't, throw some money on it? But anyway, that tends to be the way that a lot of people, especially if they're wealthier, tend to see the world, while people with less education and wealth have values that are more traditional. So most of us, whatever our social standing, tend to hold some combination of liberal and conservative attitudes. So just a word about gender here before we move on today. So there's a modest gender gap in voting patterns that paints women as slightly more liberal than men. Men express greater concern about having a powerful military to ensure national security, while women express greater concern about keeping an adequate social safety net in place to help those in need. And this is now predictive. It does not mean that all women are liberal and all men are conservative, just that there's an overall pattern found when looking at gender and voting behaviors. So a word about political parties in the 2016 presidential election. People who lean left support the Democratic Party. People who lean right support the Republican Party. Though, of course, if you lean real left, not so much supporting the Democratic Party either. So there are also wedge issues that affect support for different political parties. And as a person who studies politics, I'd love to talk to you about this all day, but I'm trying to keep it short. So power tends to shift back and forth from one major political party to the other, and we're going to talk a lot about politics later, and issues of gerrymandering and other things that also lead to political social problems. So hopefully now you have a basic idea of what social problems are and a good basis to build on in future lectures.